Most aspiring producers and guitarists make at least one of these errors when it comes to mixing guitars, and it's costing you a powerful sound. And with distorted guitars taking up most of the frequency spectrum, getting these wrong can ruin your entire mix. I've dealt with these frustrating issues firsthand for the past 20 years of producing, and I finally know my way around them. So in this video, I'm going to show you what these critical mistakes are and how to avoid them. And I'll give you an easier strategy to instantly get a heavier guitar tone. So up first is killing all the low end. Now it's really common for people to use a high pass filter to remove all of the low subby information. The problem with this is by removing so much of that low end, the only low end that is left, and therefore the only low end that your ear is drawn to, is the really muddy part. So instead of bringing up a high pass filter that far up, just take it to somewhere like 60 or 80 hertz and then try carving out some of that problematic area instead of just removing everything below it. Okay, so in the FabFilter EQ, I can go here and select A or B and have two different EQ moves. So the first move is, this is what I do. I do my high pass filter usually to around 60, and then I'm taking out some of that muddy area around 140 and a little bit at around 195. The other option is what a lot of people do, is just move their high pass filter higher up to take away more low end or low mid range. But then the only lows or low mids left in your tone is the muddiest part. And if you were to do this and then try and carve this area out as well, you're going to be left with a very thin sounding tone that doesn't have any low end or perceived low end to it. So I'm going to loop the guitars. I'm going to switch between setting A and setting B. So I've still got a multiband compressor working on this area, but it's still really noticeable to hear that kind of woo, 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 woo sound in the guitar tone. So if we just carve a bit of that out and retain some of the low end below it, you still get some fullness to the tone without chopping all the low end out, but you kind of contain and control the most problematic area. When I tried to recreate the guitar tone off the first Sarlosis record, which Scott Atkins mixed, I was really surprised at just how much subby information there is, and it sounds amazing. But it's important to remember that these guitars are in E standard. So if you're working with 7 strings or 8 strings, it's perfectly acceptable to go all the way up to like 100 hertz and just kill everything below that, because things are slightly different when you get that far down tuning wise. But you can still experiment with the same technique of high pass filtering a bit less than you might normally and carving out the area just so your low end kind of rolls off in a more smooth and natural way. Now the second problem is not filtering out really harsh frequencies, and this will be a whole video in of itself at some point in the future. But sometimes there is just this blaringly loud whistle in your guitar tone, and if you just notch it out, it'll clear up and add so much clarity to your entire mix instantly. If you can't hear anything too obnoxious in your guitar tone, try listening on different speakers, headphones, your phone, your laptop speakers, just to see if a different listening environment will draw your ear to any of these annoying frequencies. Now it's really important to remember you can easily overdo this, and tons of amazing records were made with amazing guitar tones when no one was doing any surgical EQ moves like this. But if you can identify some problematic frequencies that are inherent in a lot of guitar cabinets, this is going to add so much more clarity, and note clarity in particular, to your guitar tone. There are certain instances of records where there's just this guitar tone that has like a frequency sat on top of the entire mix, and if they were to just notch it out, the mix would be a million times better all around. It almost sounds like there's someone screaming in the background when this isn't on. So let's check it out with it off first. And it's mainly this one here at 2.2 that I can really hear really loudly. And this is a really common frequency for me to cut on a lot of cabinets. I particularly use vintage 30s and Mesa Boogie cabinets or Marshall cabinets. And 2.2 or 2.3K usually comes up as a problematic or whistly frequency on a lot of guitar cabinets. Same with 3.2. Too much EQ is essentially degrading the tone. If you can do some really precise surgical ones, then it can add a bit more clarity. This one is a really subtle one, but it was whistling to me. I could just hear it sat on top of the mix. The next problem I hear a lot of is people using stereo wideners on their guitars. I personally like a really heavy guitar tone. I want my guitars to sound thick and prominent in a mix. And if your guitars still don't sound wide enough, the problem is that you're probably just not EQing them well enough. And you'd be surprised at just how much wider your guitars can sound when they've been EQ'd and balanced properly. So I'm going to show you what a stereo widener does. Now this is an excellent stereo widener made by JST. I love it. I'm just not a fan of it on guitars because I'm a tone purist, and although sometimes I can get heavy-handed with some EQ moves and doing some notch filtering, all that kind of stuff, I want to try and retain as much clarity to the tone as I can. And there's something kind of weird and phasey sounding the more you abuse a stereo widener. I also really like the sound of guitars where the guitars are just a thick wall of guitars, and my quad tracks, I don't hard pan them. So we can hear what this does with this on and off. The problem with using a stereo widener is a lot of people use it as a crutch. It's definitely something that a lot of people do utilize, but try and get in the habit of not relying on it and not using it, especially when you're starting out. I know a lot of pros like using them, but just make sure you have a full understanding of what you're doing. And if you are going to use one, you may need to understand that you need to automate these sometimes. Which leads me on to the next error, and this is one of the biggest pet peeves of mine, and this is people leaving their guitars 100% panned in guitar breaks. I personally hate it when the band drops out, a riff comes in on its own, and it's just left at 100% panning. And when you're listening on headphones, it just sounds really thin and weedy. And the only exception to this rule that I'm going to let slide is some of those like early Slayer records or thrash records where they've got like the room mic of the guitar cabinet panned to one side, or a reverb of the guitar on one side and then the riff on the other side. But other than that, try bringing your guitars in when there's a guitar break and a guitar is just on its own. Just pan it into like 60% off to one side, and you can also increase the volume by like at least a dB to just really give those riff breaks the spotlight they deserve. And personally, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to this stuff. I don't use automation. I will just chop a guitar break out and just put it on its own track, pan it differently, put the volume up by a dB, but this also means that you can easily EQ it slightly differently. And if you want the tone to just be a bit thicker or take off some of the high end, treat it as its own thing. And then when both guitars come back in or the full band kicks back in, just go straight back to your hard panning left and right. But doing this really puts emphasis on those important guitar riff breaks. So I've bought that guitar in, it's only 72% pan to the left, and I've added some EQ to kind of thicken it up. So the tone when it's all guitars playing at the same time is a little brighter, and then made it just a little darker when the guitar is playing on its own. This is the EQ that's on this channel individually. So this is where a lot of warmth is in a guitar tone. It can be a bit muddy if you boost this within the mix, but when the guitar's on its own, this can add a bit more body between 300 and 400 or 450. The panning helps beef it up a bit so it's not just completely out of one ear. In this instance, I've got quad track guitars, and instead of automating the panning, I just chop it out, put it on its own track, and then I can do the EQ on that separate track. And then the quad track guitar is only panned 81% to the left. So there's a panning difference between them, but when they play together, you don't really hear it too noticeably. Up next, I'm going to talk about the overuse of multiband compression on your guitars. Now, this is something that I do still do, and this is often referred to as the Andy Sneap C4 trick, made popular by him. And essentially, you use a multiband compressor just to compress the region of your guitar tone where the palm mutes just get a bit out of control in the low end or the low mid range. The problem with this is people are just doing it so much they are completely neutering their guitar tone and taking all the intensity and heaviness out of it. And to me, heavy music should feel heavy, and leaving some of that dangerous sound to your guitar tone is going to feel more like a live show. So I hear a lot of people doing this so much where their guitar tone ends up sounding thinner when they're palm muting. So I'm going to loop a section of palm muting with some pretty full-on woomphy palm mutes, and I'm going to turn the C4 compressor off to begin with. So what's important to remember, if anyone's, seen like the Andy Sneap screenshot and they are trying to like mimic this sort of multiband compression, there is this little boost of 1 dB in this area. And it kind of can either help you sort of just hover in this area if you get your balance right, or it can actually add thickness and fullness to higher chords or higher parts of a riff to kind of help balance out the low end a bit. So this is normally a muddy area, but it can actually sort of boost that on parts of a riff. And again, just by a dB in this area where the tone might thin out a bit. But yeah, overdoing the multiband compression on the palm mutes can really take all the excitement and the heaviness out of the tone. And when you go to a live show, when you go and see a band and they're all using really loud live amplifiers, and you get that feeling of air being pushed. So if you take too much of this out and you over compress this, it kind of takes away from feeling heavy. And not everyone was doing this 30 years ago, and there's still loads of great heavy guitar tones from that era where the palm muting sounds heavy because it just bloomed in a really overpowering way, which can be a good thing. It is definitely useful to do, and I do always do this multiband compression, but if you can kind of get the balance right instead of just overdoing it, I hear a lot of records these days where people are just... The next problem I'm going to talk about isn't strictly a mixing problem, but it is over editing your guitars. I've heard a lot of recordings recently where people have quantized or beat detected their guitar DIs, and it sounds completely unnatural. It sounds like Guitar Pro instead of a real guitarist. And I'm going to make a video going into great detail about editing in the future. But the one way to get around this is simply spend way more time guitar tracking. No one is spending enough time tracking and getting the performances right. And if you need to go in section by section, do that as opposed to just getting the take and then quantizing and moving everything into time and chopping the DI after. Get everything right on the way in, even if it means you have to do it in smaller bite-sized chunks, and spend more time getting the performances at the source. So the last point I'm going to make is 3 points that are kind of rolled into one and they all play into each other. And that is mixing within context, balancing your levels out correctly, and using reference material. So don't be afraid to dial in your tones in solo. That is what everyone does, no matter what they say. But there comes a time when you need to just figure out the balance in the mix and start mixing within context of the whole song. If you think your guitar tone sounds a bit muddy, it could just be that they are a dB or two too loud in the mix. If they sound a bit thin, it could just be that they're too quiet in the mix. So EQ and balancing, it's a fine art to get these right. And it's important to remember when you are removing frequencies, you are removing overall volume, even if it's just in one area. You may need to then bring your guitar level up again. Same goes for if you start boosting frequencies or trying to brighten up your guitar tone, you may then have to back the volume down just a slight amount to compensate for the fact that you are adding level to your tone. And when it comes to using reference material, every mix is different. You can't necessarily Frankenstein or cherry pick elements from different mixes you like that kick drum, that snare drum, that bass sound, that guitar sound. There comes a point where the mix really just has to be all about context. But if the most important thing to you is your guitar tone, find a really great reference mix and just keep going back and forth between the same reference and your mix. Use reference tones that are in a very close proximity to the tuning that you play in. So if you play in E standard tuning, just pick really great reference tones that are also in E standard or E flat at a push. And when it comes to mixing in general, one of the best things you can do, spend 30 minutes on a mix, save it, and then just finish and don't touch it for the rest of the day. Come back the next day, listen to a reference mix for a minute or two before you listen to yours. Then when you come back to your mix with fresh ears, having just listened to a reference mix, all of the problems in your mix become way more obvious when you have fresh perspective. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of different ways you can tackle your guitar mixing, but now are your drums the weakest link in your mix? If so, check this video out next.